Hello and welcome to this special live discussion about China's National People's Congress, where delegates are trying to come up with solutions for the country's pressing economic challenges this week. To discuss China's biggest political gathering, I'm joined by DW's resident China analyst, Clifford Coonan. Clifford, thanks for joining.
Hello.
Clifford lived in China for 15 years and had a front row seat on China's transformation into the world's second biggest economy. So this is your chance to ask him any questions you may have on the National Congress and on China's economy. Just pop them in the chat and they may well find their way into the studio here, and I will put them to Clifford myself. Clifford, the National Congress opened with a government report on the economy. What did this report say?
Well, basically, the government work report is this annual event. It's delivered by the Premier, who's kind of the second in command in China, and it outlines what needs to be done with the economy. This year, the economy is facing headwinds that it hasn't had for many years. Growth is slowing down. It's because of various strains with its relations with the US and the West. It's having difficulties there. The property market has crashed, basically. They've got like this huge bubble that's slowly deflating, but it's causing all kinds of problems in the economy. People don't know how to save money. And also people don't have money to spend, so they can't, they're not buying fridges, they're not buying cars in the way that they used to a couple of years ago. So for many years we got used to double-digit economic growth, 10%, 12% higher in China. In the last few years, it's been a lot slower. So this report is trying to basically get things back on track.
What were the main points to getting things back on track?
Well, the main thing that we get from it is the target. Maybe a bit of background just about the National People's Congress. You have these two sessions, they're called. You have the Consultative Conference, which is this advisory body which meets, and then you have the National People's Congress, which is 3,000 delegates or so, delegates from around the world who meet, and from around China who come and meet, Communist Party cadres, and they discuss ways. And it's all about targets and growth. It's very old-fashioned. In some ways, it's quite familiar to people from here in Germany. We had in the German Democratic Republic, in the DDR.
It's quite ceremonial as well,
is.
right? Because the big decisions have already been made and they're essentially being communicated.
That's right, and they're given sort of rubber stamp approval. It's theatre, basically, but it is useful for giving us an idea of what's going on. And so that's why the government work report is important. And yeah, it's all about targets. It's about setting out what the government hopes to achieve. And then the delegates go back to their places, go back to the cities and municipalities around China, and they decide how they're going to meet these targets. This year, the key thing has been that China has less to operate with. It's got less to work with because of the slowing economy. Before, even when they revised growth targets downwards, part of that was because the economy was expanding anyway, so you're going to have lower growth because you're talking about a much bigger pie. But this year, they have less to work with, so it's going to be more challenging to meet this 5% growth target, which is what they came up with this year. It's around 5%, which is the exact same as last year. This has been a big issue, the fact that it was the same as last year, because they've set the same targets. If I was comparing the two documents, actually, and the growth targets are pretty much exactly the same, with one very small exception about climate goals, where they've actually put a number on it, but otherwise they're the same figures. The difference between this year and last year is that last year China was hoping for a bounce coming out of the COVID lockdown. But if you compare this year's figures with the previous year, before the COVID, with the year before the COVID situation, the pandemic, you can see that the economy is in a lot worse situation.
Right, and we have our first question here from Ireland, Richard Forrest. He writes, what could we learn in Europe from the Chinese approach to capitalism?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I mean, the Chinese approach to capitalism is, first of all, the Chinese model of capitalism with Chinese characteristics, as it's called, is basically a centralized government form of capitalism. It isn't really capitalism as such in the traditional sense, because it's very heavily regulated and it's very much focused on the Communist Party. And there has been a tendency in the West, I think, to sort of look with a certain envy at China, at the growth rates that we're seeing there, and it's even been used as an argument why Western democracy is sort of weak because it can't, look at the economy. And the thing is that you can't really compare the situations. We could certainly learn a certain amount of flexibility on how things get done, but they aren't really possible with our structures, because without having an authoritarian government, it's very difficult to do things like people talk about, say, infrastructure development. You can just build roads everywhere. You can't do that in the West because you can't just kick people out of their homes to build a road. Now, that's obviously slows down the process, but ultimately, in terms of sustainability, the Western model seems to be more appealing, certainly to people in the West, even if it's annoying at times. And it's like Churchill said about democracy, that it's a very bad model, but the alternative is still worse. And so I think as to what we can actually learn from it, I don't really think there's that much we can learn beyond the fact that China's coming from such a different place. It's a poor economy that's becoming a poor closed economy that's gradually opening up. And I think with the current model, things are going a different direction. It's coming up against these limits because it's a rigid system. It's got for example, it's finding it very difficult to innovate. Mm-hmm. It's a Marxist, Leninist economy, as we're learning in the National People's Congress. And Marxism is pretty anti-innovation if you look at it, because it basically highlights profit, maximizing profit at the expense of the worker. I'm not going to go into a Marxist down that road, but I think personally, I think we can learn a couple of things, but I think most of them are superficial. I think ultimately the structures are too different.
Right, and even comparing the Western model to the Chinese model, we see that the Chinese government in the past has been accused of dressing up its economic data, sugarcoating its current situation. But here's actually the number 2 Premier Li Qiang speaking at the National Congress yesterday.
The foundation for China's sustained economic recovery and growth is not solid enough, as evidenced by a lack of effective demand, low public expectations, and many lingering risks and hidden dangers.
So, Clifford, is this the admission of economic issues in China that we're seeing here?
I think we've seen the Premier in previous years has said things about the economy that have been negative. It's not without precedent. Li Qiang's predecessor, Li Keqiang, pointed out a few years ago that 400 million Chinese were living on about $150 a month. And it's which as a way of showing that China still had a way to go. I think, and that particular speech that he gave does end with a very positive note, saying that the wisdom and hardworking of the Chinese people and the hardworking nature of Chinese people means that China will prevail. But it does show that the headwinds are there. It's a recognition that the headwinds are there. And I think part of it is also to kind of make a campaign for people to get behind. And that's something else that the NPC does, that it encourages these sort of economic campaigns to help things. So there is, I wouldn't say it's a mea culpa, because there's no sense of the Communist Party taking responsibility for what's happening in the economy. There's a lot of blame on external forces, whereas other analysts are saying, well, actually, it's because there's been a big clampdown on the private sector. There's been restrictions on growth. The COVID crackdown was too harsh, all these other issues. So none of those issues were addressed in this, but there is a recognition that the problem is facing headwinds.
We have another question from Jezza. They asked, do they have a target for youth unemployment?
Yeah, youth unemployment is a problem, and youth unemployment is something that they're definitely out to address. They've targeted 12 million urban jobs to create this year, and they're targeting an unemployment rate of 5.5%. So they are taking the issue of youth unemployment seriously. Again,
5.5% compared to what it is today?
That's right, which would be a cut, and to cut it back to 5.5%. So if they To do that, though, there's a lot of structural issues again. A lot of Chinese growth was built from people moving from the countryside to the cities, to build the cities. And that's becoming it's still quite difficult. You still can't raise your family in the city, for example. You can go as an individual, but your family will stay in your hometown. This system called the hukou system, which is a residency permit situation that a lot of people in China have complained about. There's been measures, I think, in this National People's Congress to free up the hukou system a little bit, to make it the residency situation, to make it a bit easier, because they need to get a bit more flexible if they're going to combat this youth unemployment issue. But it also shows that there's a whole lot of issues about the low birth rate as well.
Right. Did we hear anything coming out of the Congress on measures to increase this birth rate in China? China is struggling with demographic problems. China has an economy that is labor intensive, a manufacturing based economy. They need people, but right now China is losing people because of its low birth rate. Are there any measures to tackle this?
It's there's been no specific plans outlined. I think there's an awareness of the issue. For many years, you had the one-child policy in China, which was restricted people to having one child to control the population. One of those demographic flips where suddenly China is facing what they call the demographic cliff, where it could just it suddenly has no children. And it's been very weird. At the first start of my time in China, you would see these single children with a whole family of aunts, uncles, all focused on this one child, and and that child has now grown up. That child is in their 30s now, having had all that income focused on it, all those expectations focused on it. Suddenly, China needs more, and they freed up the one-child policy. You can now have two and even three, but now you're going to have to see efforts to promote more children.
What could those look like? Well,
again, the structures are very rigid, and I think, for example, there's very, very few children born out of wedlock in China. As a single woman, if you have a child, you won't get educational benefits. You won't get. There's a lot of benefits you won't get. That's not just China, by the way. You see that in other areas. It's cultural in parts of East Asia and other parts of East Asia too. And also the low birth rate is happening in other parts of Asia too. Korea recently showed data that it's got the lowest birth rate in the developed world. And measures to combat this are very difficult, because what you need to do, even though education is free, people are still prepared to pay for education. They see education as an investment, and it's expensive.
So they think having children is too expensive, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And also it's too difficult to build the same issues, global issues for women, about how you can't build a career if you want to have children. There's a feeling that you're going to miss out, and you need structures in place to make sure that women don't feel they're not disadvantaged by having children. But to introduce those measures takes a whole change in the mindset, in a way. I mean, if you look at the leadership in China, there's no women in the standing committee. There's never been a woman in the standing committee. You've had women, senior figures in the Politburo, but very, very few. Female representation in the structure of power is very low.
And it would require more spending on a social state, on a welfare state, in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. You need to change whole areas within the system, and so there's no sign in this NPC of that happening, even though it's clearly necessary.
If you're only joining us now, welcome to the special live edition by DW Business on China's National People's Congress. If you have any questions on the People's Congress or on the Chinese economy, please put them in the chat, and I will put them to Clifford, our resident China analyst. Clifford, another point that was mentioned yesterday during the kickoff of the Congress was security security spending. China plans on spending 7.2% more on security this year. This is in line with a decade of pretty aggressive security spending on the part of China. With a backdrop of a struggling economy, does this mean that Xi Jinping is putting security spending over spending on the economy?
Yeah, I think where you're seeing the issue with security in particular, there is an obsession. You've seen obviously the increase in defence spending. You've seen the increase on domestic security services, the People's Armed Police. All of these, the rocket force, all of these areas are doing, all of these parts of the economy are being heavily invested. It becomes a problem with things like innovation, this obsession with security. A lot of Chinese innovation is in things like surveillance technology. You have all these areas where where China is really leading. But the obsession with security has also meant a crackdown on people, on tycoons, for example. Jack Ma being an example at Alibaba, who made some negative comments about the state banking sector, and then was disappeared effectively for a long period of time, and he's since re-emerged, but his company has effectively been taken away from him. And it's happened with a lot of other tech tycoons who are seen as a threat to security. It's seen as a threat to the authority of the Communist Party. And those things work against innovation. So instead of one of the things that's been discussed, a new measure that's been discussed, is new productive forces, which is all about high-tech development and moving away from the traditional economic growth model. But it's very focused, it's all got this sort of security aspect to it. So,
and also the self-sufficiency aspect, if I understood correctly. So
that's right.
The same trend that we're seeing in Europe and the US, but also happening in China.
Yeah, that's it. And I think so. A lot of the areas that it should be focusing on, it needs to be more broad. These new productive forces need to be focused on much more broadly on the economy, but I think they're going to probably be very heavily focused on security. And then when it comes to the other things, we've just had data released that show that German exports have increased strongly to China. German exports have risen for their best level for many months, and a big part of that was an increase in exports to China. So they're probably just going to import quite a lot of the stuff that, they are definitely focusing on cars and electric vehicles with technologies that they've already absorbed from Western car makers, for example, combined with these incredible production developments that they've made there. But now you're going to see more pressure, I think, they need to do more to broaden this productive force if they are going to kickstart growth in the economy. But I think it's going to be, instead, there's a sort of, like, Xi Jinping has this hang-up about security, which is clearly now impacting on the broader economy.
Right. Another big issue that the Chinese economy is grappling with is consumption, and analysts were hoping for a big stimulus package being announced this week. Now, in the plan yesterday, there was an announcement of 1 trillion yuan in bonds. Is this the big stimulus package that analysts were hoping for?
I don't think so. It's not really enough. It's 140 billion, I think, dollars. It's anyway trillion yuan. It's not as much as people were hoping for. I don't really know what people were hoping for in terms of stimulus. I mean, there's a limit to what you can do. I mean, I know that one thing that they've done is there's this scheme, Cash for Clunkers, where you basically give in your car and you get cash back. They're probably
your car and other appliances even.
That's right,
now,
and
right?
appliances, yeah. But the thing is,
Old
TVs, fridges, that kind of thing. So you buy a new. But the thing is, they want you to buy a new TV and a new car. Previously, people have taken the money and saved it because there's a big urge to save, to pay for things like education, healthcare, all these things that we were talking about earlier. But I think what you're seeing now is that it's going straight to your phone. It's going on to, you have to use it to spend. Now, that may have some effect, but these are bitty elements. It's not in some ways a cohesive policy. Obviously these things, China is so big and the scale is so massive that they do have an impact. But the question is whether it'll be enough to bring the economy around more broadly. And I think that's something that's going to be a struggle.
We have one question from James Astra. How will China's economic downturn affect Western countries?
Well, yeah, this question, given what we just spoke about German
Especially
exports,
in Germany, yeah.
Germany's links to China economically are very strong, and they're growing, as we've seen, and Germany hasn't enthusiastically gotten on board with Western efforts to restrict how exports go there. The US has been very aggressive in this, in that they don't want technologies that can be used for defense purposes going to China, and that's fed into a broader slowdown of exports to China and increasingly strained relations. Germany has kept pretty much, hasn't changed its view. I mean, within the coalition, the ruling coalition here, you see divisions over what's strategic rival, and but coming from the Chancellor's side, it's very much business as usual. He's going there again in April. He'll be heading, no doubt, a very large trade delegation. So for Germany, it's always going to be very much business as usual. Even though these reports come through, like we've seen in recent weeks with BASF involved in Xinjiang, where there's a crackdown against Uyghurs, and how that involvement has come in for criticism because of human rights concerns. It's almost like they run in parallel.
Yeah, and the economic slowdown in China is being felt directly here in Germany as well, though even though Germany isn't as cautious as the US. If there's less consumption in China, a country like Germany with a big export market in China is already feeling it, correct?
That's right. I mean, Germany is such an export economy. There doesn't seem to be there was an effort to boost exports to the US. The US exports to the US have also been rising over the years of slightly more strained relations between Germany and China. But and the exports have increased to Southeast Asia. But Germany seems to have a very strong fixation with China in terms of, I mean, there's been some diversification. A lot of people within the government have been encouraging diversification away from this over-reliance on the Chinese market, because you could say that China is only going to be interested in German imports as long as it can't manufacture them themselves. And as we've seen with electric vehicles, now they've got the EV technology. The VW's e-vehicles don't sell well, for example, in China. They
anymore.
Yeah.
Well, VW sold well, but not the electric vehicles.
Yeah. The electric vehicles they've just been completely sidelined. They've had to come up against huge state subsidies for the EV sector in China, and they can't compete. But a lot of the technology would be very familiar to anyone who is involved in the development of Volkswagen's electric vehicles. So, this issue is definitely there.
Yeah, and I guess the question is also, if there is not the internal demand in China, will the push be for more exporting of cheaper goods that are highly competitive compared to European goods? So can we expect a continuation of cheap loans being given, for example, to electric vehicles manufacturers, but also chips manufacturers, etc.? Is that a trend that's likely to continue?
I think so. And I think there's a couple of things going on at the NPC that we can see relate to this at the National People's Congress, where they're saying we do need better relations with the West. They're very focused on the US, obviously, but it's a lot less belligerent in its approach to the US.
Is that because of the economic damage that this trend towards decoupling has presented?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's why it's happening. It needs to. There was still talk about external forces. I mean, it's again this obsession with security. It's almost like there's two trains of thought at work. There's this sort of immediate reaction to the US is to go on the offensive. A lot of the things like backing Russia in the war with Ukraine, coming out more against Israel in the Middle East. These kind of things are very much a lot of it is down to the fact that it's a way of getting at the US, if you separate out the other issues. And you see that. But at the same time, there's also a lot of fear about what's going to happen if Trump wins the election, because nobody knows what's going to happen if Trump wins the election, whether he'd be pro or anti-China, because it's unknowable. But
so that's why the tone is softer than compared to previous years, maybe?
I think so, yeah. I think it's almost like trying to lay as much of a groundwork there of a positive relationship before Trump gets in. That will make it harder to dismantle, perhaps, or cushion the blow. Also to create better markets for Chinese goods overseas now, because there is a big focus on exports, as we mentioned with e-vehicles. There's a lot of this going on. This foreign focus is definitely there.
We have a question from Sparky5960. Do you think the top leadership is very concerned about the poor state of the economy?
Yeah, this is a very good question, because sometimes it's hard to know how much Xi Jinping counters this into his thinking, because you definitely, with this NPC, this National People's Congress, one thing that's happened is that they've gotten rid of the press conference at the end. Now, this press conference was very carefully managed, and questions were chosen, and it was basically part of the theatre, but it was a way of a point of contact between the international media and the leadership of the party. And it was always done by the premier, because Xi Jinping doesn't give press conferences. In my recollection, he's given one, which was when
was that?
That was back in when Obama was in power. I think it was 2011, 2012, and and he answered one question. But normally the leader doesn't talk to the media. It's done by the premier. But now that this press conference is gone, the premier has been sidelined even further. And the focus is much more on Xi Jinping again. So in some ways it's a power move.
But it could also be a move indicating that there is a level of concern.
Yeah, I mean, concern to the point that no more information less information is better. I think he does understand what's going on. Obviously, he understands what's going on, but it's a question of how he deals with it. You do see quite a lot of rhetoric coming out, and it's part of the function of the theatre of the National People's Congress that it's dressed up in this Marxist-Leninist language. But I think there is genuine concern now about the economy, because ultimately it will threaten security and threaten stability. And that's the approach. That's the angle at which he's approaching this issue. So for this question, I think they're concerned, but also
they're masking it as almost an external threat rather than something that they're involved in.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, when we were talking earlier about the mea culpa in the recognition that there were problems in Li Qiang's speech, in the premier's speech, I don't think there's there will be no attempt to take responsibility for this, because that will be a sign of weakness. And one thing the leadership will not do is show any kind of weakness. So there will be an attempt to blame everyone else, but it certainly won't be in any way construed as a failure of policy from within the central leadership.
We have another question. If you have any more questions, please pop them in the chat, and I will pose them to Clifford, our China analyst. And Thomas Ripple is asking: are they worried about climate change? Which actions are they taking economically about climate change?
Well, one of the differences in this year's targets was that there were more specifics about climate change protection goals and carbon emission. Still pretty broad approach. I think the climate change, like a lot of these international issues, is a bargaining tool. I think it's something that you can negotiate using. I don't really think that there's that much concern within the leadership itself about climate change. I think it's seen as something that you can trade, you can use. Obviously, the message is that they want to improve people's lives, and part of improving people's lives is by improving the climate. But as we've seen, once the economy faced a serious downturn, like with COVID, the switch to coal was immediate. I know not just China did that, but basically it's not. I don't think it's clearly not a political issue in the way it is in the West, because you don't have there's no Green Party in China. It's just the party. So I think it's, as long as it makes economic sense, if it's cheaper to use wind or solar, they're definitely going to push it. And their thinking is very much focused on the economic benefits of it. It's not there's no ideological reasoning behind combating climate change. I think it's very much based on the hard economic facts. So I think the fear is more about the economic downside. It proved very expensive, for example, clearing the pollution in Beijing, and it's still improved a lot, but it hasn't totally gone away. You just have to move all these factories. So I think that any fears that are there about climate change are about what it's going to cost.
Right. And maybe to go back to the change in growth. So we have this 5% growth target. Experts are saying that target is even high. I think the IMF predicted 4.6% this year. And this stands in very stark contrast to what we've been seeing in the past decade. We've been seeing double-digit growth, as you mentioned. Back in 2012, we saw 8% growth. Then during the pandemic, obviously, slowdown in growth. But the rebound hasn't been as successful as expected. We saw 5.2% last year. Then this year, this goal of 5%. Now, there is also an argument that says China can't keep growing this rapidly at double digits forever. So what part of this growth slowdown is just a natural slowing down of growth, and which part maybe has problematic economic roots?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, because it was clear this was never going to last forever. And you're going to see growth slowing because it's a bigger, it's going to expand by less because the relative base is increased. It was always a question of how managed that was. I think the pandemic, I don't think we've really begun to deal with the effects of the pandemic in terms of what it's done to the global economy. And I think in China, they're very much dealing with it. Because it took such an extreme approach, extreme lockdown approach. I still think it's reeling a little bit from that, and its belief that growth would immediately bounce back after COVID clearly didn't happen. If you take 5% growth target, that's about 1.3% per quarter. That's a lot, and given that the rest of the world, the global markets are still sluggish. I mean, there's not quite in recession, but there's not massive demand coming from overseas. And then within China, we have deflation, where prices are falling, which means people are, even if they do get money on their phone for getting rid of their old fridge, they're less likely to spend it. The people don't want to. You're not going to buy a car if you think the price is going to decrease in a month's time. So for big ticket items, there's less demand. So the conditions make meeting this target very difficult. I guess the question is by how much they'll miss it, how much they'll fall short. Some people, like you say, the 4.6% from the IMF. Other people have then questioned the whole validity of Chinese GDP data anyway, whether it's and you could take that view too. But I think realistically, it's going to fall short. I'd be hesitant to make any forecasts because it's just so difficult to know. They can always bring in other factors. There could be a revival. Those German export statistics, for example, show that that clearly some aspects of the market are picking up. So I think to actually put down a percentage prediction, I'd be loath to do, but I think it won't. I think it will fall short of the 5%.
We have another question from Single and Hot. As Western consumer brands continue to decline in sales in China. Will the West look to bar access to its markets for cheap e-vehicles, solar and battery brands as a way to limit China's monopolies? Yeah, so as we mentioned, EVs from Volkswagen are not very popular in China. Chinese EVs, on the other hand, in Europe are gaining in popularity. What is Europe or the West doing about this discrepancy?
Well, this is where Germany's approach to China is problematic, because instead of using Germany's economic muscle to encourage better level playing fields, it's going for the quicker market benefits, I think, by boosting exports. And instead of making difficult decisions which would maybe protect German brands better.
What could those be?
Well, for example, a Chinese EV built by BYD. BYD is massively subsidized by the Shenzhen government, by the Guangdong government. Its chief executive is a member of this Congress. They're very, very tightly linked. I know it's a private company, but it's one of those private companies that's a national champion, like Huawei. It's deeply, deeply linked to the state.
Right, and many analysts are not expecting these subsidies to end anytime soon. This is not a problem that will just fade away.
Exactly, because it's structural. Because basically, it's enmeshed in the DNA of the company. Is that it's part of the model of this centralized statist model that exists in China. Now, I know VW also has links to the state of Lower Saxony, but it's different. It's not the same. First of all, it's an elected.
Not the same scale.
Yeah, and definitely not on the same scale. Germany does have a statist history going way back. You had companies that were very closely linked to the government, but Deutsche Telekom, for example, was this German state telecoms company, but now it's largely a private company. So it's very.
And we should clarify that VW is not subsidized by the German government.
No, it's not subsidized. It has links to the state of Lower Saxony, which are historical, which and the stakeholding is there, but it's not exactly. It's not a. Yeah, you're right to clarify that. And it's just often people will say, well, what about Volkswagen? But in this case, the what about argument with the car makers in Germany and with private companies in Germany and in the West generally doesn't hold water. Chinese companies' links to the state are often very, very deep.
So deep that the European Commission has actually launched an investigation into these subsidies. And depending on the findings of that investigation, could impose tariffs on China going forward. So this is, I think, maybe these are the measures that the question might be targeting at now. Nothing has been decided yet, and it's obviously also risky for a Western economy like the EU to put tariffs on Chinese goods, because China is still a really important market, specifically for these big European countries like Germany. Yeah. So it's a little bit of being between a rock and a hard place.
Absolutely, it's almost like a short versus long-term decision. I mean, if you look at this, let's just look at the car sector for a moment, because if you compare. Everyone is saying, a lot of German car companies are worried about companies like Nokia. They're worried about Kodak. At what point where Nokia was just suddenly disappeared? It went from being one of the biggest companies in the world to practically disappearing overnight.
We all had a Nokia in 2007.
And then suddenly it's gone. Everyone's gone up. At what point does that happen? Because the technology was absorbed by cheaper manufacturers or Kodak cameras. Use Kodak. Everyone used to have a Kodak camera. Use Kodak film.
They're back in style.
They're back in style, but it's niche now, though. Right? I don't think the penetration isn't as big as it used to be. At a certain point, if you don't protect what you have, it'll disappear. All the Japanese camera makers, they used to be. Now they're just basically high end. They've been absorbed into so many other industries.
Germany's solar industry is a great example for that. Germany's solar industry has essentially disappeared, and because of the competition coming from China, where the solar industry is heavily subsidized and much cheaper solar panels flooded the German market, and now all these big startups in Germany that are selling solar panels use Chinese solar panels.
Yeah. Exactly, and this is it. I mean, it's not like China doesn't want VW to dominate the market. It is going to help its domestic. because of the structure of the economy, it wants to provide jobs in the local areas. It wants the revenues from, and it can do it because the EU, for example, doesn't do anything about it. I mean, because
Germany's against it.
Yeah, exactly. But even this is because EU rules. It's different. They're two different games. You talk about different playing fields, but it's two different games. Where you can't subsidize things in the EU to the extent that you can in China. So theoretically, the subsidies on EVs coming in should be massive. They should be. But the political will isn't there because of the strong lobbying by big European companies. I mean, we tend to talk about Germany a lot, and we are in Germany, but there's a lot of big French companies, big Italian companies who are doing the same. So this is something that these are identity issues going forward for corporate about the future of industries in Europe.
And also ideological in a way. Should we heavily subsidize in prop-up sectors, or should we combat those economies who do that?
Yeah.
We have another question from Sparky 5960. This tug of war between control versus liberalism, do you think that this will cause further leadership disputes? So we spoke about this push for security, clamping down on tycoons that have been critical. Is this going to be a problem for Xi Jinping going forward?
This is a very, very interesting question, and it's a key question. And this is, at what point does this translate into instability within the leadership? And at this point, Xi Jinping has centered so much power around himself, and if you read these statements coming out of the government work report and everything to do with it, it's all the Communist Party of China with the core, with Xi Jinping, General Secretary Xi Jinping at its core. Everything is he's in everything. So, which means he has a lot of power, but it also puts him at a lot of risk if things start to go wrong. So, I mean, I think further leadership disputes. It's hard to know at what level there are disputes going on within the leadership, and this is what a lot of China watchers spend their time trying to, examining the entrails, looking for some kind of sign about what's going on, and we really don't know. We do believe that there are factions within the leadership, but it would seem that Xi's faction is very, very strong right now, and the way that Li Qiang, who is his close ally, he's appointed him as premier, but even Qin Gang, the foreign minister, who's just disappeared, the head of the defense minister disappeared.
So there aren't as much disputes probably as they are.
Yeah, because he's just getting rid of people.
Yeah.
I mean, and Qin Gang is a great example of someone who was his protege. He's an ally within his ranks, so that he feels confident enough and strong enough that he can just dispense with his foreign minister, which is a hugely high profile thing to do, and it's an incredibly it's quite a ruthless move. So I think that this question about leadership disputes, it's a really interesting question, and I think it is very much a thing between control and liberalism, and that debate is going on. You would think that you just wonder how many of these things can at what point will they start to gain traction? And I think that's I know I'm not really answering the question because I'm not going to make any predictions on this, but analysing it, I think it becomes a question of at what point this tension translates boils over. Exactly.
Yeah. We have another question from Sparky 5960. The property market slump. Forming 25% of the economy, around 25% of the economy is expected to be in dire straits for up to 10 years. What will China do to reinvigorate it? Right, we've not been speaking about one of the big elephants in the room, the property sector. Are there any news this week out for the property sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously everything is sort of linked. I mean, the fact that as the question points out, it's such a huge percentage of the economy. Looking back at since this has been going on for about 2.5 years now, and looking at the way there's almost like a sense of there is a property bubble that is. It's almost like they're letting it slowly deflate, and there is very much we tend to get quite excited about developments in China, whereas I think with the leadership, they tend to just stop and let things move very, very slowly. And eventually, things, in the belief that things eventually will go away. The question with the property market is that it's so huge. It's 25% of the economy. It's savings for a huge number of people. It's such an important part. There haven't been any measures that look significant enough to make a dent in this. I think.
What about the recent decisions regarding the big real estate companies? What kind of direction is the government following regarding that?
Well, again, these decisions, we've had recent court cases in Hong Kong about Country Garden and Evergrande, two of the big companies. They're being reined in, but I just don't think I don't really get a sense in the government that they know what to do about it. A lot of that is the overseas creditors, and I don't think they particularly care about what the overseas creditors are doing. And I think the longer it goes on, the chances of social instability, I think, lessen because they're just hoping that eventually the problem will. It seems to be almost like they're hoping the problem will resolve itself. But I don't really see. There's no concrete measures that are there, and maybe this is going to be one of those factors in this tension between liberalism and control, as the questioner put it. Maybe I think this is going to be a big factor in it. But I don't see anything significant in terms of addressing the issue beyond. I mean, there are little things, lip service here and there. But you still have huge local government debt because of the property crisis. That's still there. All of these things are there. Perhaps the fact that in the absence of a major stimulus shows that the cash isn't there, rather than try and make the local governments get even more into debt and start building more airports and more roads or whatever. That isn't there. Maybe we could see that as a kind of a measure, but it's I don't see much concrete there.
I guess this is related to what you were just mentioning. Jezza asks, what can they do to stimulate the economy? We've been talking a lot about what's not being done, about the focus on security. What are analysts hoping the Chinese government will do to stimulate the economy?
Well, I think this comes down to the question of reform. And reform is one of those words that we tend to see in the West, tend to see reform as liberalization. In China, you have a lot of discussion about reform, but when they actually happen, the reforms that have happened have been quite opaque in many ways. You're talking about fundamental reforms to the economy in a way, to make it easier for private insurance, for example, private healthcare, a lot of things that the state controls. Reform, like we were talking about earlier, that allows tech companies to operate more freely. We can talk about press freedom, but if you look at press freedom as being part of the communications industry, the freedom of the internet, all of these sort of activities are part of a broader picture of economic well-being that you can see. There's a lot of areas where China could potentially grow, but it's limited by the structure of the control by the party.
How would more press freedom stimulate economic growth?
Well, press freedom would be part of a broader freeing up. There's so many restrictions on how the internet operates that it means it's just for buying and selling goods. But that's only part of what the online world means. I know this sounds quite nebulous, but it's part of a broader thing about economic liberalism. And one of the great thinkers on totalitarianism, Stephen Kotkin, talks about how reform is kind of impossible because ultimately the party can't really reform because it goes against its very existence. So there's ultimately a lot of this comes down to a structural issue about the Communist Party, that it cannot make a lot of these reforms because it's not able to, because it would require levels of freedom that it cannot tolerate. So at the risk of getting too theoretical, that's kind of what things come down to.
At the risk of ending on this bleak point, thank you so much for joining us, Clifford, and thank you for sending in your questions. That was DW Business live on the Chinese People's Congress. Thank you so much for joining and for tuning in, and see you next time. Right. Brought